The captain joined them on stage, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. The image captured by news photographers told a powerful story. The veteran officer who had led the change, the young man who had inspired it, and the officer who had learned from it. As the event wound down, people lingered to talk and share stories. Kids played basketball in the newly renovated gym while officers cheered them on. Community members and police chatted over coffee and snacks, planning future projects together. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in beautiful colors. The captain's son stood on the steps watching people leave. A young girl tugged at his sleeve. "When I grow up," she said, "I want to be on the youth council too." He smiled, remembering how a moment of injustice had opened the door to lasting change. "You know what?" he told her. "The future belongs to all of us. We just have to be brave enough to shape it together." Inside his pocket, he touched the acceptance letter from the police academy. Soon he would begin his own journey wearing the badge, carrying with him the lessons of the past year. That true justice comes not from power, but from understanding, and that sometimes the worst moments can inspire the best changes if we're brave enough to learn from them. 1 year had passed since that fateful afternoon. The community center's main hall was decorated with balloons and banners for a special celebration. Tables lined the walls, covered with photos documenting the journey of change that had transformed their town into a model for police-community relations. The captain's son, now a high school senior, adjusted his tie as he prepared to address the crowd. The audience was a mix of faces: police officers, community members, reporters, and representatives from other cities hoping to learn from their experience. His father gave him an encouraging nod from the front row. "A year ago," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I was just a kid walking home from basketball practice. I never imagined that moment would change not just my life, but our entire community." He gestured to a wall where news articles told the story of their town's transformation. But what's more important is what happened after. We didn't let anger divide us. Instead, we used it to fuel positive change. He clicked through slides showing the results of their Youth Advisory Council's work, statistics demonstrating a 70% drop in confrontational police encounters, doubled community participation in police programs, and improved response times due to better community cooperation. In the audience, Officer Barrett sat quietly. He'd become an unexpected advocate for change, traveling to other departments to share his story. "I was wrong," he would tell them, "but being wrong taught me how to be right." His honesty about his mistakes had helped other officers confront their own biases. The presentation continued with video clips from their new training programs. One showed elderly residents teaching officers about their cultural traditions. Another featured teenagers giving officers tours of their neighborhoods, explaining what made them feel safe or unsafe. "Our basketball games aren't just games anymore," the captain's son explained, pointing to photos of police youth matches. "They're where officers learn our names, hear our stories, and understand our dreams, and where we learn that behind each badge is a person who can choose to make a difference." Mrs. Chen stood up to share her story, her voice full of emotion. "Now when I see a police car in our neighborhood, I don't worry anymore. I know those officers. They've sat in my garden, tried my cooking, and helped my grandchildren with their homework." The captain's wife presented the legal side of their success. Thanks to their new policies, complaints against officers had dropped significantly. Other departments were adopting their training methods, and state legislators were considering making some of their reforms mandatory statewide. But numbers don't tell the whole story, the captain's son continued. He played a recent video of a police encounter in their neighborhood. An officer approached a group of teenagers playing basketball after dark. Instead of confrontation, the officer joined their game, then helped them set up proper lighting for the court. This is what change looks like in real life. The presentation shifted to future plans. The Youth Council was expanding, with new programs connecting officers with local schools. Community members would help train new recruits, sharing their perspectives and experiences. The department was even starting a scholarship program for teens interested in law enforcement careers. "A year ago, someone asked me if I still wanted to be a police officer like my dad," he said, looking at his father. "Today, I'm proud to announce that I've been accepted into the police academy for next fall. But I'm going in with a different perspective than I would have had before." Officer Barrett stood up, surprising everyone. "May I say something?" he asked. Walking to the front, he faced the crowd. A year ago, I was the problem. I judged this young man based on nothing but prejudice. Today, he's teaching me how to be a better officer and a better person. That's not just change, that's transformation. As the sun set outside, casting an orange glow through the gym's high windows, the captain's son gathered his things. His notebook was full of new ideas from today's session. On his way out, he passed the department's mission statement, recently rewritten with community input. The words caught the fading light: to protect, serve, and understand, together. Walking home, he noticed something different. The same route that had once filled him with anxiety now felt like a path of purpose. Officers on patrol waved as they passed. Neighbors called out greetings. What had started as a moment of injustice had grown into a movement for change, proving that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes. 6 months had passed since the hearing, and the police department's main training room looked different now. The walls, once bare except for procedure posters, now displayed community artwork and photos from joint police community events. Today, the room was packed for a special training session. The captain's son stood at the podium, no longer showing any traces of the bruise that had once marked his face. His research project had evolved into something much bigger: a comprehensive training program designed by teens for police officers. Behind him, a screen showed statistics and real-world examples. I could have chosen to be angry, he told the room full of officers, some newly recruited, others veterans of the force. Instead, I chose to make a difference. He clicked to the next slide, showing a map of their community marked with different colored dots. These dots represent every police interaction in our neighborhood over the past 6 months. The colors show the outcomes: green for positive, yellow for neutral, red for negative. The room grew quiet as they studied the patterns. There were more green dots than before, but still enough red ones to show that work remained to be done. One of the new recruits raised her hand. How do we make sure we're adding green dots, not red ones? The captain, standing at the back of the room, smiled proudly as his son launched into an explanation of the new protocols they'd developed. The changes hadn't been easy. Some officers had resisted at first, seeing new requirements for community engagement as extra work, but the results were starting to show. In the corner, Officer Barrett sat taking notes. After the hearing, he'd been given a choice: resignation or complete retraining with community service. He'd chosen the harder path of staying and working to change. Now he spent his off-duty hours volunteering at the community center, coaching youth basketball alongside the boy he'd once wrongly accused. The training session broke into small groups, each led by a teenager from the community. They role-played common scenarios, but with a twist: the officers had to experience them from the civilian perspective. The captain's son watched as his classmates guided veteran officers through situations they thought they understood, only to see them gain new insights. Remember, he said, walking between the groups, every interaction is a chance to build trust or break it. We're not asking you to stop being police officers, we're asking you to be better ones. During the lunch break, conversations spilled into the hallway. Officers shared stories of how the new approach had changed their daily work. One told about helping a lost teenager instead of immediately treating him with suspicion. Another described how regular coffee meetings with neighborhood residents had led to solving 3 cases through improved community cooperation. The captain's wife arrived with a stack of papers, the latest statistics from other departments who'd adopted their training program. It's spreading, she told her son excitedly. 3 more cities want to implement it next month. Later that afternoon, they gathered in the department's gym for the weekly basketball game, officers versus community teens. What had started as a simple idea for building relationships had become a highlight of the week. The captain's son dribbled past Officer Barrett, who grinned and called out, "Getting better every week, kid." The sound of squeaking sneakers and laughter filled the gym. Parents watched from the bleachers, chatting with off-duty officers. The walls displayed fresh posters advertising the upcoming community safety fair, designed by local art students. After the game, everyone gathered for pizza, another new tradition. The captain stood to make an announcement. Next week, he said, we're starting phase 2 of our reforms. Every officer will spend 1 shift per month working at community organizations. We're not just serving the community anymore, we're becoming part of it. His son added, and every teen in our youth program will get a chance to ride along with an officer, seeing both sides of the story. He caught Officer Barrett's eye across the room, and they shared a nod of understanding. Both knew that real change happened through small moments like these, building bridges one interaction at a time. The board called a recess to deliberate. As people filed out of the room, conversations buzzed about potential outcomes, but something had already shifted. This wasn't just about punishing one officer, it was about acknowledging and addressing deeper issues. The captain's son tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, "do you think anything will really change?" The captain looked around the room, at the diverse faces of concerned citizens, at the officers wrestling with uncomfortable truths, at the board members carrying the weight of their decision. "Change starts with accountability, son. And today, we're holding ourselves accountable." As they waited for the board's decision, the autumn sun continued its arc across the sky, shining through the windows of the hearing room. Its light fell equally on everyone present, illuminating a moment of reckoning that would reshape not just one department, but an entire community's approach to justice and equality. The police department's hearing room felt smaller than usual that morning. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden tables. Officer Barrett sat alone on one side, his uniform pressed but his shoulders slumped. The room was packed with observers, fellow officers, community members, and press representatives all squeezed into the available space. The disciplinary board, composed of senior officers from neighboring districts and 2 civilian oversight members, sat at the elevated panel desk. Files and tablets lay before them, containing weeks of investigation results. The body camera footage had been reviewed countless times. Witness statements had been collected. Past complaints had been unearthed. Officer Barrett, the head of the board, began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "We're here today to address the events of October 15th, but before we begin, I want to make something clear. This hearing isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of behavior that has finally come to light." Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the board played the footage again. The sharp sound of the slap echoed through the room's speakers, causing several people to flinch. The teenager's calm voice stating his address seemed even more impactful now. Then came the witnesses. Mrs. Chen described how she'd watched the boy grow up, how he'd helped carry her groceries countless times. The basketball coach spoke about his leadership on the team. Each testimony painted a picture of a young man who was everything Barrett had assumed he wasn't. But the most powerful moment came when Captain Johnson took the stand. He didn't sit, he stood tall, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. For several seconds, he just looked at Barrett, his expression not angry, just deeply disappointed. "I've served this department for 20 years, he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I've worked hard to build trust between our officers and our community. I've trained countless rookies, teaching them that our job is to protect and serve everyone equally. And yes, I've had to have difficult conversations with my son about how to stay safe during police encounters, conversations no parent should have to have." He paused, looking down at his hands before continuing. "But today, I'm not here as a captain. I'm here as a father who had to watch his son get assaulted for simply walking home. I'm here as a black officer who, despite wearing this badge, knows that my son still faces prejudice. And I'm here as someone who believes that we can and must do better." The room was so quiet you could hear the ceiling fan spinning above. Barrett couldn't meet the captain's eyes. His own lawyer shifted nervously beside him. Then came the evidence from Internal Affairs. Previous complaints that had been filed against Barrett emerged, incidents that had been dismissed or buried. A troubling pattern emerged of escalated encounters, particularly with minority civilians. The board members' faces grew grimmer with each revelation. "Officer Barrett," one board member asked, "did you ever complete the mandatory bias training from last spring?" Barrett cleared his throat. I was on vacation that week." "And the makeup session?" There was a schedule conflict. The captain's wife, who had been quietly observing from the back, began taking rapid notes. As both a civil rights attorney and a mother, she saw this hearing as a chance to push for systemic change. Near the end of the hearing, the board asked Barrett if he had anything to say. He stood slowly, his face pale. He started, then stopped. For the first time, he looked directly at the captain's son, who sat between his parents. The teenager met his gaze steadily. "I made assumptions," Barrett finally said, his voice barely audible. "I saw what I expected to see, not what was actually there. And because of those assumptions, I'd violated not just my training, but the basic trust that should exist between police and the community we serve." The local community center buzzed with energy as people filed in, filling every available seat. The usual weekly bingo night had been transformed into an emergency community meeting. Handmade signs dotted the crowd: "Protect our kids," "Reform now," "Support Captain Johnson." The air was thick with purpose and determination. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, her garden club friends beside her. She'd been the first to capture video of the incident, and now she clutched a folder containing dozens of printed screenshots from her security cameras. Behind her sat Mr. Wilson, the retired teacher who'd watched the captain's son grow up, his usually cheerful face now creased with worry. The basketball coach stood near the door, his entire team present, wearing their jerseys in solidarity. They formed a protective circle around their teammate, the captain's son, who seemed both touched and overwhelmed by the support. His father had suggested he skip the meeting, but he'd insisted on coming. "It's my story too," he'd said. Local news cameras lined the back wall as the town mayor approached the podium. "What happened last week," she began, her voice firm, "is not who we are as a community, but it has shown us who we need to become." The meeting quickly turned into a flood of revelations. A young store clerk described how Officer Barrett had harassed him while he was closing up shop. A college student recalled being followed for 3 blocks while walking to the library. Each story strengthened the pattern, and with each speaker, more hands went up. "My son doesn't want to walk to school anymore," one mother shared, her voice breaking. "He used to love being a crossing guard, but now he's afraid." Murmurs of understanding rippled through the crowd. Parents exchanged knowing looks. They'd all had similar conversations with their children over the past week. The captain's wife, notepad in hand, documented everything. Each testimony added another piece to the legal puzzle she was building. But more than that, each story highlighted how deeply this incident had touched the community's heart. A young police officer, fresh from the academy, stood up. "I work with Captain Johnson," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "He trained most of us himself. He taught us that a badge means we serve the community, not that we're above it. What Officer Barrett did goes against everything we stand for." Other officers in the crowd nodded. More than half the precinct had shown up, not in uniform but as community members. They weren't there to defend one of their own, they were there to stand with their neighbors. The captain's son listened to it all, occasionally making notes on his phone. His research project on community policing had taken on new meaning. This wasn't just about data anymore, it was about real people, real fears, and real hope for change. Near the end of the meeting, a small girl raised her hand. She couldn't have been more than 10. "My mom says you want to be a police officer like your dad," she said, looking directly at the captain's son. "Are you still going to do it, even after what happened?" The room fell silent. The captain's son stood slowly, aware of all eyes on him. The bruise on his face had faded, but everyone knew it was there. "Yes," he said firmly. "Because now I know even better why good officers are needed. And maybe, when I wear the badge, I can help make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous roar. Even those who'd come angry left inspired. The community wasn't just asking for change, they were ready to work for it. Outside, as people filed out into the evening air, small groups formed on the sidewalk. Parents exchanged phone numbers, planning carpools for kids who were now afraid to walk. Officers chatted with residents, rebuilding trust one conversation at a time. Local business owners discussed installing more security cameras, not to watch for criminals, but to protect their community members. The captain's son watched it all from the community center steps. A week ago, he'd been just another teenager walking home from practice. Now he was at the center of something much bigger. His father joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" the captain asked softly. The boy nodded, looking at the gathering of people, different ages, backgrounds, and roles in the community, all united. "You know what's weird, Dad? Officer Barrett wanted to make me feel like I didn't belong here. But his actions just proved how much I do." As the sun set behind the community center, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Plans were already being made. Tomorrow, there would be meetings with city council members, interviews with civil rights organizations, and the start of real policy changes. But tonight, a community had come together, turning anger into action and fear into hope. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of the Johnson family home, but nobody was enjoying the beautiful day. The captain's son sat at the breakfast table, pushing his cereal around in the bowl, barely eating. His mother, a respected civil rights attorney, was already on her third cup of coffee, her laptop open as she reviewed the incident footage for the 100th time. "You don't have to go to school today if you're not feeling up to it," she said softly, watching her son's distant expression. The bruise on his cheek had faded to a dull purple, but the emotional marks ran deeper. "I have to," he replied, straightening his shoulders. "I have a chemistry test and basketball practice after school." His voice was steady, but his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glass of orange juice. "I can't let him win by hiding at home." His father entered the kitchen, already in his full uniform. Dark circles under his eyes revealed the sleepless night he'd spent dealing with press inquiries and department procedures. He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember, Officer Chen will drive you to school today." "Dad, I can walk. It's just a few blocks." The boy's voice caught as he saw his parents exchange worried glances. The same walk he'd made hundreds of times now felt different. The same streets that held memories of learning to ride his bike, playing with friends, and jogging with his basketball team now carried a shadow of fear. At the precinct, Captain Johnson faced his own challenges. The incident had split the department. Most officers stood firmly behind him, disgusted by Barrett's actions. But a few remained quietly defensive of Barrett, making excuses about the pressures of the job and split-second decisions. The captain's secretary handed him another stack of messages. News organizations wanted statements. Community leaders demanded action. Other police departments called asking about their handling procedures. His inbox was flooded with emails from parents sharing similar stories, thankful that someone with authority was finally facing this issue head-on. In his office, he stared at a photo on his desk, his son's last birthday, the whole family smiling at the camera. His boy had always wanted to follow in his footsteps, proud of his father's badge and what it represented. Now, that dream had been tainted. Meanwhile, at the family's law firm, his wife was building a case that went beyond just one incident. Her team had uncovered a pattern in Barrett's previous assignments, a history of complaints that had been brushed aside or buried in paperwork. Each complaint told a similar story, but none had the clear video evidence and high-profile connection that her son's case provided. Back at school, the captain's son tried to focus on his chemistry equations, but his mind kept drifting. Students whispered when he passed in the hallways. Some offered support, while others seemed almost excited by the drama. His basketball coach pulled him aside between classes. "The team's behind you, 100%, the coach assured him. "But if you need a break from practice," the boy shook his head firmly. The court was his sanctuary, the one place where none of this mattered. He wasn't going to let Officer Barrett take that away from him too. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, their phones buzzed simultaneously, news alerts. The video had gone viral. National media outlets were picking up the story. Their private family trauma was becoming a public symbol of a larger issue. "We need to get ahead of this," his mother said, already making notes on her phone. "People need to see that this isn't just about us. It's about every kid who walks home from practice, every teenager who gets profiled, every parent who has to have the talk with their children about how to survive a police encounter." The captain nodded slowly. "The department's internal investigation is moving forward, but this goes deeper than just disciplinary action. We need real change." He looked at his son. "What do you think? You're the one who's been studying community policing." The boy was quiet for a moment, thinking about his research project, about all the hours he'd spent interviewing officers and community members. Maybe this happened for a reason," he said finally. "Maybe we can use this to make things better. Not just here, but everywhere." His parents shared a look of pride mixed with sadness. Their son was showing more wisdom and strength than any teenager should have to. As the sun set outside their window, they began to plan. This wasn't just about punishment or justice anymore, it was about transformation. The hard part wasn't over, In many ways, it was just beginning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the precinct, casting a harsh glow across the worn linoleum floors. Officer Barrett sat at his desk, filling out the incident report with sharp, angry strokes of his pen. He was still convinced he'd done nothing wrong, just another troublemaker in a nice neighborhood, or so he thought. The usual evening buzz of the precinct filled the air, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, and the occasional burst of radio static. But something felt different tonight. There was a tension in the air, like the quiet before a storm. Barrett noticed other officers glancing his way, then quickly looking away when he caught their eyes. "Captain's coming in hot," someone whispered nearby. Barrett barely looked up, until he heard the heavy double doors slam open. The sound echoed through the precinct like a thunderclap, and everyone fell silent. Captain Johnson stood in the doorway, still in his formal police uniform, his face set in stone. He'd just left an important community meeting, but that didn't matter now. The whispers started immediately. Officers who'd known the captain for years had never seen him like this, the usual warmth in his eyes replaced by something harder, colder. Barrett finally looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, I was just filing a report about a suspicious." The words died in his throat as he saw the teenager from earlier standing slightly behind the captain, his cheek still red from the slap. The color drained from Barrett's face so quickly that another officer later swore he turned gray. His pen clattered to the desk. The teenager wasn't just some troublemaker, he was the captain's son. The same son whose academic achievements the captain proudly displayed in his office. The same kid who'd helped organize the precinct's last community basketball tournament. "Officer Barrett." The captain's voice was quiet, but it carried across the now silent room like a blade. "My office." Now, each word fell like a hammer blow. Barrett stood on shaky legs, his throat suddenly dry as sandpaper. As they walked toward the office, the captain's son stayed in the main area, where a senior officer immediately brought him an ice pack and started taking his statement. The boy's quiet dignity as he recounted the incident made Barrett's actions look even worse. Inside the office, Captain Johnson closed the door with careful control. Photos on the wall told the story: 20 years of service, community awards, and family pictures, including one of his son in his basketball uniform from last season's championship game. "Explain yourself," the captain said, his voice level but vibrating with controlled anger. Barrett started his usual script about suspicious behavior, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The captain held up a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "Two things you should know," the captain said, turning his computer monitor around. "First, Mrs. Chen from Oak Street sent me this video 10 minutes ago." The footage played silently, showing the entire incident from her front yard perspective. Barrett's stomach churned as he watched himself escalate a perfectly peaceful situation. "Second," the captain continued, pulling up another window, "my son's bodycam footage." Barrett's confusion must have shown on his face because the captain's next words hit like a punch to the gut. "Yes, Officer Barrett. My son is part of our youth police mentorship program. He was wearing a bodycam for his research project on community policing. The same project he presented at last month's department meeting, the meeting you skipped." The realization of just how badly he'd misjudged the situation crashed over Barrett like a wave. Not only had he assaulted an innocent teenager, but he'd done it to someone who was actively working to build bridges between the police and the community. Someone who, despite everything that had just happened to him, was still out there giving his statement with professionalism and composure. A knock on the door interrupted them. The shift supervisor entered with a stack of papers. "Sir, Internal Affairs is here, and the bodycam footage has already been uploaded to the system." Barrett sank into a chair, the weight of his actions finally hitting him full force. This wasn't going away with a simple apology or written reprimand. Through the office blinds, he could see news vans already pulling up outside the precinct. His actions hadn't just embarrassed himself, he'd damaged the trust that Captain Johnson and his son had spent years building in their community. As he watched the captain step out to check on his son, Barrett realized that this revelation was just the beginning. The real storm was still to come. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the peaceful suburban streets of Oak Ridge. A teenager walked home from basketball practice, his sports bag slung over his shoulder and his practice jersey still damp with sweat. He'd stayed late to work on his three-point shots, hoping to improve his chances of making team captain next season. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the occasional sound of leaves crunching beneath his feet. Most of his neighbors were familiar with him. He'd grown up here, after all. Mrs. Chen from 2 doors down had just waved at him from her garden, and old Mr. Wilson's golden retriever had barked its usual friendly greeting. But today felt different. He noticed a police cruiser rolling slowly down the street, following his path. The officer inside watched him intently through the window. The teen tried to stay calm, remembering his father's words, "Always keep your cool, no matter what." His heart started beating faster, but he maintained his steady pace, trying to act as normal as possible. The cruiser's lights suddenly flashed on. "Stop right there." A stern voice commanded through the speaker. The teenager stopped, his hands visible at his sides, just as his parents had taught him. Officer Barrett stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his holster, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" the officer demanded, his tone harsh and accusatory. The boy swallowed hard, keeping his voice steady as he replied, "I live here, sir. Just heading home from basketball practice." "Right." Officer Barrett scoffed, clearly disbelieving. "Got any ID on you?" The teen nodded slowly. "Yes, sir, in my wallet. May I reach for it?" Slowly, Barrett barked, stepping closer. The boy carefully moved his hand toward his back pocket, but something about the movement made Barrett tense up. Before the teen could even touch his wallet, a sharp crack echoed through the quiet street as Barrett's hand connected with his face. The force of the slap sent the boy stumbling backward, his sports bag falling to the ground. Basketball rolled out onto the perfectly manicured lawn. Neighbors began appearing at their windows, some quickly pulling out their phones to record the scene. Mrs. Chen dropped her gardening tools in shock. "On the ground now," Barrett shouted, but the teen remained standing, one hand touching his stinging cheek, eyes wide with disbelief and fear. "Sir," he said, his voice trembling but clear, "my father is Police Captain Johnson. We live at 1242 Oak Street, right there." He pointed to a well-kept 2-story house just a few doors down. Barrett's face twitched, but he maintained his aggressive stance. "Sure, and I'm the Tooth Fairy." "On the ground, or—" He was cut off by the crackle of his radio. A familiar voice came through, stern and authoritative. "Officer Barrett, stand down immediately. That's an order." The boy's father had been alerted by concerned neighbors who recognized his son. Now, the consequences of Barrett's actions were about to unfold in ways he never expected. The quiet suburban street had become the stage for a confrontation that would shake the entire police department to its core. Through it all, the teenager stood there, his cheeks still stinging, watching as his father's police vehicle turned the corner, lights flashing. In that moment, he wasn't just a police captain's son. He was living proof that no amount of status or respectability could fully shield someone from the harsh reality of prejudice. The setting sun cast long shadows across the scene, marking the beginning of a story that would change not just their lives, but their entire community.